First of all, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure this is going to be a really interesting session, and a lot of us are super invested in this, Indian startup space. So this is going to be super insightful for us. So Sajid is a longtime media executive turned VC at Bloom VC in Delhi. He supports investments in media, HR tech, ed tech, and agri tech, while simultaneously helping Bloom build a research and knowledge platform. He's also a prolific writer. I know I've been following his writings for the last 2 years. His writings cover startups and e-commerce to culture and education, and have been published in Scroll, Quartz, BuzzFeed, and the Times of India. And some of the most interesting written work of his that I have really enjoyed reading over the last 2 years or so entails a framework for Indian consumer segments, the unbundling of social networking platforms, and even his predictions about the media industry, which hopefully we'll get to talk about in the Q&A session later on. Just some quick instructions. So the format of our discussion today will be divided into 3 sessions. We'll start off with a presentation by Sajid on deconstructing Indian startups, followed by a short moderated Q&A, and finally conclude with questions from our audience. On that note, Sajid, the floor is all yours.
Thanks for this, Devyansh. So let me start by sharing my screen. It's really a kind of a presentation that we use to kind of chat with students, typically aspirants. But I kind of cobbled together, added a few slides just to set context for this event. As with all of these things, I'm going to structure it as a 30 to 35 minute conversation. Is that fine with 30 minute presentation? Or how are you seeing it? 30 is fine, something like that? Yeah. Okay. So if it's 30 minutes, so one issue with me is I talk fast. You'll have to kind of, I think all of this too. So listening to me, sometimes it's like, like that 1.25x on Spotify. So I also listen to podcasts in 1.25x mode. So yeah, and normally always read transcripts, but anyway, but hey, if one of you needs to kind of button, if there are people asking about some particular topic, I like to keep it interactive. I don't like concept where I'm talking all throughout. So I would say like every 3-4 minutes, Anuj, Divyansh, Anmita, who is like kind of 3 of you, if you guys are, you could always ping me and we could double click into something, and that could be a good thing. So maybe and I would love it that way. It's punctuated a little bit. And so I'll try and go fast, and it's hard because it's not a physical talk. You can't get reactions. So I'd love it if at least 3 of you kind of who is moderating this kind of gives me a few pings. Hey, people didn't understand this, etc. And the audience could kind of put questions in the chat or chat. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's one thing I just want to make clear for our audience. If you guys have any questions for our end session of Q&A from the audience, you can put up your questions in the chat, and we will definitely try and include them in our last session.
Yeah. Can you guys see my screen now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it fine? Yeah. Okay. Great. So broadly 3 parts to this. Really look at, and so it's really about deconstructing startups. But to really understand startups, we really need to understand the venture ecosystem as well. So, what I'm going to do is really try and give you some context about that, how VC works, then the startup journey, and then the few what I call nuances, etc. Which will be so it's like only 2 slides, but it's possibly it's probably the one which I can end up talking for hours about. So, but anyway, let's begin. So quick look at how venture capital works. Really, and the way it is, and a lot of people sometimes think that VCs invest their own money. No. So we're sort of like a mutual fund, except that we are long only. We invest for very long periods of time. We typically take money from typically other rich people, pension funds, institutions, so to say, like for example, GIC or a sovereign fund or a university, for example, Berkeley. Berkeley would have investments in Sequoia, very likely, etc., etc. So CalPERS, the California pension thing, so they would have investments in funds. They're called limited partners because they're limited in the way that they don't take active interest. They give money to us, and that's called, and we are called GPs, general partners. And we invest in the companies, Then we sell whatever, we make money, we sell those companies and we return the money back. So at present at Bloom, we are managing our third fund, which is about 100 million fund. And in this fund, every year we get a fee of 2% for managing. Okay, so that's $2 million, which is used for salaries, etc. I'll come to it. But to be very honest with you, in the venture ecosystem, you don't make, and that's one of the things you need to know. If you're a VC, and if you're in this entire asset management business, so private asset management, as you say, the larger the fund size, the more you end up earning. So if any of you kind of, can offer from KKR over like a small kind of a fund of $50 million, if money is an important criteria, you should always take KKR because the fund size are so larger, they can actually pay you more. So the 2% really covers your basic sink cost, but we really make money. I really make money when my company does well, and I get to keep 20% of the overall fund, and I kind of drill down on it in the next one. And the money goes back to the limited partners. So what do we do? And this kind of a sense of the roles that exist. The sense of the roles that exist. I'll just try and minimize the screen. Yeah. So fundraising is critical, and you can't have a fund to invest until you raise a fund. And raising a fund means we go hat in hand to all of the limited partners or people who invest, for example, CalPERS, Ontario Teachers, Scottish Widows, UPenn, Stanford Endowment, Harvard Endowment, XYZ, Berkeley, all XYZ. And we kind of, so before you can invest, before you get on the buy side, you need to be on the sell side. And so VC, there's a lot of sales in VC, and surprisingly people think it's all buy side, actually a lot of sell side. Second is source interesting startups. And here's the other sell side. If it's a great founder, you got to beg to get on his cap table because founders have choice, right? So the best startups are where you're struggling to get on the cap table because there's so much demand, etc. Invest, of course, do all of the dirty work here. So, sort of a interesting way to put it is there is finding, grinding, and minding. So, which is finding this thing, grinding is really doing the hard work of this thing, and last is minding, where you kind of monitor it, support it, etc., which is the add value, portfolio management, etc. And then hopefully like get an exit. Okay, so this is sort of the and sort of give you a sense of the roles. So, for example, me. I don't have to do fundraising. That's like the partner level thing, and the Karthik and Sanjay and Ashish do a lot more of it. But at some point, I grow into it. If I need to become like a partner, this is one area where I can kind of contribute, and I'll probably take a set of LPs and try and get money from them, etc. Then, of course, I do most of the three middle parts: sourcing, investing, adding value, making money. None of my exits have happened yet. Hopefully, it will happen. There's one happening, but it's it's a small one happening, but. Really, I think the big ones haven't happened yet. Yeah. So let me go to the next one. Very quickly, so if you take Bloom's 100 million fund, so the 220 structure, that's 2% management fee. So that's the third line, every year the VC fund gets 2 million for salaries and expenses. If the 200 million fund will get 4 million every year, like that. So effectively what it means is 2 goes down, and you have about 80 million to invest in. Okay, because 2 into 10 years, etc. So that 80 million you invest, and now here's and this is really what's called portfolio construction. You typically in a VC, you have, if you do, so the way it works is you have to keep some money for the next rounds, because if your winners break out, they will need more monies, and then you need to put money in them. And so, for example, Peter Thiel gave a great AMA, and someone asked him, "What's your biggest regret?" He said, "Not doing my pro rata on the Facebook B." So when Greylock, I think, did Facebook B or thing. So I think basically he had 10% stake. He could have he had rights to maintain his stake, but he probably let go of it or something. And Facebook then like really grew massively from there. So his biggest regret was that, because it's like easy money, right? Like, there's a company you invested in, you hold 15 or 20% of it. The next round, you have pro rata rights. You can invest to hold this thing. And if it's a great company, you always want your pro rata. It's hard to get pro rata. So that money that you invest for your pro rata is called the reserve. So reserves typically are, we keep about 50 million, so the remaining 80 million. So typically Bloom has to 1:2 reserve ratio. So we've kept 50 million as follow-on checks. And I'll tell you why and all that. And about 25 million, 26 million is for next, the first checks. Okay. So typically that means you can do about 25 investments. Okay. So, and if you look at, for example, the deal flow, we get about 2,000 to 3,000 investment opportunities a year, but 600, 700 really high quality ones. And you can only do 25 by 3, 8. So, and let's say what happens now after the fund ends, 10 years. Okay, so 2030 it ends, and let's say we take all of this 26 investments, and typically the way it will work is 15, 16 would not make any money for you. Like, 15, 16 would die. Either they would die like very quickly, or they would die like, but nothing happens. Like, they don't make any material money. Everything is written off. Then the remaining, out of the remaining 10, 12, about 4, 5, you will make about 1 to 1.25x of your money. Barely mistake. The remaining 5, 7 is where you really make money. 2 to 3 of them will do really well. And they'll like huge breakouts, like Unacademy in our second fund. Like massive breakouts, like, so typically what we do is we add up all the returns from these. Let's say it totals up to 300 million. We subtract the 100 million that's we've raised, 200 million. Now, of course, there's a hurdle rate. The hurdle rate is typically 2x. So once it's about 200 million, you can pay yourself carry. And the carry is typically 300 minus 100, which is the original one, into 20%. That's 40 million. The rest goes to the LPs. So this is where VC will make money. And typically this is, but like, you don't have to wait till the end of the year. If you are having a really good set of years exits, you can also prepay your carry, etc. All of that happen. But this is broadly so this is important. This is a slide that came from Andreessen Horowitz. So it's actually there's an LP called Horsley Bridge. Horsley Bridge did this analysis of some 6,000, 7,000 deals, and they found out something very interesting. That only like 6% of deals kind of account for 60% of the returns, and this is actually fairly brutal. So. And I have a great chart as well, which says that, like, and I'll kind of show you the Indian story here. But fundamentally, very few, and all VC investments, all fund investment typically follow a power law. You never have a situation where it's never happened, probably never happen, where all the 25 investments that we do will provide equal returns. Can't. There's always a sharp power law where one brings you like 30, 40x of the investments, or 50x, another brings you 20x, 10x. So it's sort of this classic power law. And so the VC business is fundamentally very attractive because of two simple things. The power law. Power law is always there. And secondly, asymmetric returns. What I mean is I can only lose 1 million. But if I do well, I can make like 30, 40 million dollars on an investment. So that's kind of led it to a very, so these actually two factors have resulted in a certain kind of an industry. So VCs fund a kind of a startup. So so the terms, and what's happened is people are saying that, hey, VCs are glorifying startups that are unprofitable, etc. And unfortunately or fortunately, that's happened. And I think we need to distinguish between two kinds of startups. VCs fund a certain kind of, it's sort of like greenhouse, right? Like we want them to grow very fast. It's like bamboo, as opposed to a slow growing, slow evolving thing. VC business is designed to fund those hyper growing startups. And because time is short, like because we're running 25 experiments, like we think, hey, someone comes and says, I want to kind of create something like, I don't know, like a digital cookbook that will do this, etc. And you'll order ingredients on the fly. Okay, great. It's an experiment. Will it work? Don't know. Here's 500K. Go run the experiment, right? Like, so that's how we kind of think about it. And for us, we're very happy with founders who fail fast. Okay, because you can typically pivot or etc. The worst kind of startup is which kind of, when you say like this whole theory, there are some startups which like do amazingly well. You invest in them, you don't have to do anything. They're just growing at like crazy speed. Then there are startups which fail fast. Perfect. The worst are actually these middle level startups, which are sort of like what I call liquid oxygen. As the old Hindi joke goes, liquid tumhe jeene nahi dega, oxygen tumhe marne nahi dega. So these lock startups are like the worst, but there's a lot of learning in them. So they build your reputation because founders, they're struggling, and the thing is they take a lot of energy and they don't always give the results, but you have a lot of learning. So the fact is there are two kinds of startups, and VCs are fundamentally focused on hyper-growth startups. Hyper-growth startups are designed for scale, right? We want them to be massive, super massive. Okay, if they're not hyper growing, we're not interested in them, right? That means great startups can come and great founders can come and will only grow 2x, 3x. And we're going to tell them, hey, we can't. It's not a hyper growth model. I mean, it's not designed to be. And then sometimes they get irritated, etc. And I think somewhere along the line, VCs have not clarified. I think we've ended up owning the entire startup world, whereas there can be multiple kinds of startup. So maybe VC should be designed for hyper growth startups. Like I've had a lot of people reach out to me and I have to tell them like, hey, because it's so easy to reach a VC, especially if you're in the top 1% in India. You will know someone who knows someone reaches out and says, hey, I have this kind of, homegrown tuition center business, which is this. So I tell them, why do you want VC money? Like, but if you look at this whole debate about Basecamp, David Henmeier Hassan, DHH, Jason Fried, they're all saying VCs, and they're all saying VCs own the startup lingo and they own the entrepreneurship vocabulary. There are multiple types of entrepreneurship. Hey, running a Subway store in the US is entrepreneurship too, and it's not easy, So that is critical, and I think this is a wonderful tweet from Bennett Given which I put here. I think it's good to see VC money as hyperfuel. It's great. If you want to go to the moon, we'll give you rocket fuel. But if you're going to kind of go to the farm and ride your tractor around, putting rocket fuel is not generally a good idea. But that said, there's nothing wrong with tractors too. So I always think it's a great metaphor to kind of see businesses. Feel free to interrupt me anytime.
Yeah, Sachin.
Yeah.
So if you could just go back to the previous slide. Yeah. So no, the next one. Yeah, this one. So I just had a quick question. So you spoke about how VCs fund a certain kind of like hyper-growing startups, right? At what point do founders consider the trade-off between? So Reid Hoffman has this like really cool analogy of how a startup is like jumping off a plane and like building a parachute on the way, right? So how do you trade off between planning and between just going with the flow? What is your take on that?
Yeah. So planning is good. Sticking to the plan isn't always good. So what I mean is things change, right? Not always good to micro plan. Like at early stage, we get these pitch decks and with an Excel file, which details out 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and who knows 6 months whether it will exist or not. So all we want to know is what and we'll come to that, how we can evaluate, etc. But I think too much planning is also not good, right? So fundamentally, you have to be excited about a massive opportunity. I see like this really massive opportunity, surprising. Something is so big here, but why isn't it so big here? Or in the future, people will be renting clothes like they rent in Uber, and like every person coming out of college and or going to college will have a rental app on her or his phone. So that's my vision of the future. I want to build to it, or something like that, right? So then you're fundamentally obsessed by the problem, and you're really figuring out. You're telling to the VC and say, "Hey, this is the problem. I'm really obsessed by it. I'm this really bright, like ambitious, driven person, and I want to spend the next 3 years of my life building for this, right? And I don't know the path. Sure, right founder, you'll say, I don't know the path. I don't know it'll work. This is what I think. These are 2-3 things I want to try. And typically VCs like that. VCs say, great, this is a problem. Seems big, gnarly, massive problem. We're going to, go and run these experiments. So early stage is a lot like that. Once you get a Series A, Series B, the paths are more or less defined. That to get to the moon, you've got to shoot it at this thing and your rocket needs to be somewhere there. Right? But at the early stage, you don't know where you're going to launch them. You're going to launch on Cape Canaveral, or you're going to launch them in India. God knows, how are you going to get to the moon? Don't know. We'll figure it out. But we want to get to the moon. So that's the obsession. So what I wanted to say was, at the early stage, it's hard to plan. We are actually giving you money to figure out the way, as much at the early stage, super early stage. But yeah, so too much planning is not good.
Zoom meeting.
Yeah, someone is. Shall I continue? Hello?
Yeah, sorry about that. I think somebody just turned their...
Yeah. Shall I continue? Shall I continue? Did you
Yeah.
get a sense of this thing? So too much planning is not good. Things change, right? Like COVID, things change. Like if you planned like, so, but at the same time, you can't commit, it's a problem. So there are issues. So yeah. So very quickly, careers in PE, we see, so PE is the elder brother of this thing. So there are two kinds of PEs. One very traditional PE, which needs profitable this thing. Then there is private equity, which is with a venture feel, which is like Norwest Venture Partners or General Atlantic. Whereas the KKRs of the world are more, Clayton Dubilier and Rice, they're more like traditional, like, you know, Blackstone. They're more traditional. They want to see huge profitable these things. So PE in India, if you're looking come back and work for PE in India, I think PE pays more because fund sizes are larger. PEs, but there are also smaller teams. So I mean, yeah. So you'll know enough of your brethren there. So that's a little more slower world. I mean, I can never work in a PE because it's fundamentally super slow. They take time to close deals, etc. VCs are again, it's all self-explanatory. There are homegrown players like Bloom, or there are like larger funds like, I mean, like Lightspeed, or like franchises of international firms. So so broadly, this is really the. So I think this. I mean, I'm happy to share this deck with you. Some of you may be taking screenshots if required, whatever. It's being recorded. So I won't go through this, but this might be a good point. This and the next one is a good point to actually just pause and maybe take one or two questions. So this is broadly. I mean, those who's graduating. So this is how at least Bloom looks at it. So we typically take folks who have graduated 2 years out. We like people coming from consulting, sometimes startups, etc. So, okay, then there's a path to associate. Associate is where sometimes and beginning to look at it as well, because there's a lot of analyst churn. Whether we should kind of just have a 2-year analyst program and then bring in someone as an associate from an MBA school, or MBA is not important also. Then principal. So I'm kind of at this level. And finally, there's a partner. So this is sort of this one. There are no path. There's also a path where someone can join theoretically and just continue throughout, right? That's possible. There's also a path where you can start out you work in consulting 1-2 years, then decide, find an interesting startup problem, attack it. 6-7 years you build that, and then you join a VC firm as a principal, or if you've done really well as a partner. All possible. Or you can set up on fund. So the point I wanted to say is it's extremely competitive, and that's one of the challenges. So positioning yourself is, I think, critical, and the ways you can position yourself would be primarily, of course, going through a known source helps, but where you can position yourself is also to have like startup related creds projects to signal that you're interested in the startup world, etc. And then there are lots of interesting allied opportunities opening up. So two interesting ones I'll talk about are within the VC firm, the platform role has become interesting. So the ways in which we help value add is like hiring, fundraising, helping them connect with partners like AWS or Google Cloud, founder learning and development through community initiatives, content. Okay, so content becomes this really big thing in VC firms. So these platform roles are like really kind of become big. Second is a lot of incubators, accelerators want talented young people to kind of come in and run. Sometimes corporate this thing. So and overall lots of new interesting kind of opening up. The industry is growing fast. Every year about 40-50 new positions get created. It's not a large one like in the US, unfortunately. So yeah. So and pay depends. It's not as highly paid as consulting. So within the pecking order, I would say that consulting would be the highest paid, most likely for a McKinsey, BCG. iBanking is good, but top tier iBank. But your bonus will be good. If your bonus is really good, you can end up making the most because it's a year, right? You have a great deal you work on and support, and partner might, and you can end up making a lot of money. Second is last is so again, last is VC. Again, in VC, if you're working for a Sequoia or Lightspeed, you typically get a lot more because the fund size are larger and they have this thing. So then it comes down to companies like Bloom, etc. Because we have a smaller fund size and our brand is built around come for the learning, not for the earning. So it all depends on the firm you're joining, etc., the culture, etc. But typically, like I would say that if you're coming back to India, smaller accelerators, smaller incubators, smaller venture funds, anywhere from the late teens, mid-teens, late teens to at apex, but 20 to 25 lakhs maybe in some of the like larger funds. But unlike and there's not a lot of bonus beyond this because if you're very young, you don't get carry or you don't get this. You might get a like maybe a small bonus of 10% or something. But fundamentally they're buying into the fact that it's an exciting job and there's enough meeting of new people, there's enough learning happening, etc. So yeah.
Sajid, yeah. So we had a question for you in terms of like, what is the biggest misconception you see in young people trying to enter the VC world in terms of like the ideal background to be a VC or a PE guy, the ideal idea to have, the ideal, yeah, like IIT, IIMs, you need an MBA and stuff like that.
Yeah. I'll double click on it. So analyst, you don't need a MBA, I feel. But there are firms where there is an analyst with an MBA. So there's no rule this thing. But typically, like for Bloom, we don't take someone who is a MBA. We take someone who's at least 2 years after college. So the fact is, I'll come to the specific term I've kind of coined this one. So yes, there are a lot of IITs, etc. BITS is another one. Premier Engineering College talent is overrepresented, no doubt about it. But that's not the only route. There are enough folks from so I'm not an engineer. Kartikeya Shekhar, who went to INSEAD and joined us as an associate, he studied at NM College. So there are enough exceptions happening. Radhika, she did an economics. She's in Berkeley has. So she did a undergrad in economics from Berkeley. So there are enough exceptions coming. So I would say that the industry is now expanding in India. People are cognizant of having diverse perspectives. And but yes, you do see a lot of people from IIT Bombay, specifically these two schools. And third could be KGP, fourth could be BITS. These four schools are a little overrepresented.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
No, I think we can move ahead.
Yeah. Great. So the startup journey, so it's sort of like a fun thing. So this is really how the startup journey goes. But so this is sort of this is probably a cleaner way to look at it. So fundamentally, so Bloom kind of comes here at this seed pre-series A level, somewhere here. So typically, like if you've started up, you have an idea. Okay, let's say I want to like look at some kind of a opportunity in the fertility space, right? Okay, and you're excited by that and whatever. So when you come to us, typically we want to see very strong sense of the problem. This is the problem. This is what's wrong with the world as is, and this is what I'm going to do to get the world to where it should be. It's great to have a team, and it's good to have 2 members, but it's not essential. It's great to have some customer validation. Okay, that makes it a little harder. Yes, there are examples if you're very storied, if you're like exceptional, etc. It's fine. We can even do idea stage funding, but it's uncommon in India, let's say. So we typically invest between $750K to $1 million, and this is typically so these days it's very easy to get all these angel lists, Let's venture capitalists to kind of give you money. And so what that has done is pushed us to seed pre-series A, where we come in with $1 million. So our objective is to get you to series A in 12 to 15 months. And that's the Bloom promise. So Bloom's role, so it's sort of like a relay where someone starts out and then we take the baton from like the angel lists, angel investors, and take it to series A. And at series A, something extraordinary has to happen, and that's called product market fit. And there's a great essay by Mark Anderson called product market. I don't know the exact term, but it talks about how PMF is the single most important thing for a startup. And I'll come to that. You can write a book on that, So Then there's Series B. So every 12 to 15 to 18 months, you raise a round. So what happens is the risk curve changes. So it's good to see it as a 0 to 1 to 10 journey. So Bloom comes in, so 0 is when it's just idea stage, right? And 0 to 0.25 is typically you take money from friends, families, and now of course AngelList syndicates, like, so 0 to 0.25 or 0.2 to 1 is what Bloom does. We get you to product market fit. We help you run, we help you think through experiments, etc. Get you to product market fit. Product market fit broadly, and I'll kind of come to this. So PMF is broadly, you could say that at once it hits PMF, then you know that every rupee invested in the business will give more than a rupee back. Pre-PMF, there's no guarantee that every rupee invested will give every rupee back. Okay, so that's actually an important distinction, and you kind of get this when you kind of starting when you're doing startups and all that. But sort of this is important. So when someone comes to us, there's something like an MVP all getting built, and there's the early stage of an MVP getting built. There's at least some clarity, and there's some customer validation, some test, etc. So that's when we kind of get in and fund it. Sometimes we fund it after MVP, but almost always before product market fit. Okay, product market fit is Series A. That's series. A product market fit means every rupee invested will give more than 1x the money back. And the business, that's called growth capital. So then from Series A to Series B. Now Series B means your product market is there, you made it work. Now you need rinse and repeat money. Of course, there are other challenges. You're scaling up, you're going international, etc. So typically at seed to Series A, it's about $1 million to $1.5 million. Seed pre-Series A now, $1 million to $1.5 million. Could even be 750K. So 750K to $1.5 million. Series A is 3 to 7 million. Series B is 10 to 20 million. Series C is like 50 million and up. And after that, it really, like, it all depends on the startup and stuff like that. Yeah, so it's important. Most startups fail. So this is a great Bain report. So they looked at the last 10 years, sort of like the time that Bloom existed. So India, 79,000 startups launched. Only 8% got funded. Only 8%. It's crazy, right? 6,400. So the 6,400, only 25% got seed funding, like, 1,600. So 1,600, only what, 40% got, so Series A. And then the ratio kind of holds, because by then there's already winnowing of quality. So if you look at it from the company it launched, only 300 out of 79,000. That's like less than 0.1%. Made it to Series C. Series C is where we get some money back. So I think this is something to remember, that, but startups also great learning. That's like MBA at hyper speed. 2 years doing a startup and failing teaches you a lot. And you could look at startup as a new MBA. I keep hearing YC is a new HBS or whatever. So yeah. So startup valuation. How does valuation happen? So it's funny, right? Valuation is just fundamentally like if I need to value a company, it's fundamentally valuation is derived in our business. So we tell them, look, we can only invest 1 million. And typically we want 20% equity. So it's 1 by 20% is 5 million is the value. Value is derived in our business. So value is a function of the money we can put in and the stake we need. That's why supply demand. Don't know how to value, but there are good thumb rules that have evolved. As it gets closer to Series B, Series C, you start looking at those. You see, each person is looking at, like when we invest, we're looking at when the Series A guy come in, what will he come in at? And Series A guy is saying, oh, what will the Series B come in and what's he or she looking at? Series C, what's she looking at? Like, and so on and so forth. So it's like a well-constructed pack of cards. And that's why when SoftBank comes and does stuff, it can actually shake up the whole thing. So what we do here is fundamentally go by the rules of supply and demand. So valuation is a derived outcome. You can't, unlike private equity where you calculate the valuation through a discounted cash flow method. Here we actually, so in fact in VC, strange, you don't need to know much of finance. You can be an analyst without knowing much of finance, because what finance will you do? You need arithmetic, right? My 14-year-old daughter has all the math knowledge needed to run a VC firm. Of course, like it gets complicated at higher levels, IRR calculation, etc. Again, there are formulas. So the strangest thing is, in our business, a lot of finance people get excited, but venture capital is a great, it's actually behavioral economics. It's a great business to understand human behavior. And because when you're investing in a team, you don't know anything about them. And our meetings take 4 hours to decide. Like it's shocking how little time is spent between the founder and this one. Because there'll be a series of 3 meetings, and each meeting is like 45 minutes to an hour. And at the end of it, you'll take a decision. It's incredible how less time goes in. And typically, if you look at like Peter Thiel's investment in Facebook, or even like Sequoia's investment in Google, etc., I don't think those meetings would have happened for more than 2 hours. So VC teaches a lot about people and this thing. So I think it's a great business for a liberal arts grad as well. I don't think you need to know much of, and that's why there are a lot of great VCs who've studied philosophy, who've studied, like, for example, science, like, for example, they've not studied finance. I don't think it's needed at all. Yeah.
Just a quick thing. So we're getting a lot of questions about the Indian ecosystem in particular.
Yeah.
So could you?
Yeah. We can go there. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You have slides on that. That's great.
What are the questions? So this was about. Okay. I can go into this. What are the questions like? Should I kind of just look at them, and is it possible to kind of look at one sec? I don't think I can see the thing now, but
yeah. I think this would cover quite a bit, and then we can like move on to the moderated section, and we can like ask you the questions or have the people ask you themselves.
Great. Yeah. I think, So broadly, I think the Indian startup system, it's kind of, I call it Indus Valley because, but unlike like Silicon Valley or something, which is like one geographical area, we are split between Bangalore and again, like specific parts of Bangalore. I call it Silicon Halli, which is sort of like the Indira Nagar to Bellandur area, and Gurgaon, some parts of Noida, some parts of Pune, some parts of Chennai. So Bombay too, to an extent, but broadly, these are all the pockets of startup culture in India. So and I can drill down into the questions. It'll be best to kind of ask me directly there because that's it. So the other point I wanted to say was kind of my favorite term, Srini schools. So basically, I see a lot of founders are typically from and a lot of schools ranging from even like VIT, Vellore Institute of Technology, and Manipal, all the way to IIT. So it's a myth that there's only IITs. So they all are selective, residential with national input, right? So this is what I call screening. And so the entire Indian startup community is dominated by these schools, really. Then a little bit about gender imbalance. It's still unfriendly for a lot of women, etc. Then there are specific strategies I have, etc. But it might actually be a good point now to actually just get into the moderated part and for you to actually ask me specific questions. And I'm happy to answer them as much as possible. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So we'll just dive right in.
Yeah.
So just before the call actually started, we were talking about, your EdTech report that, Shubham.
Yeah.
And a lot of us have been following. So our first question is, we've all been following firms like, Lambda School and now White Hat Junior in India that teach people how to code. There's even a couple of organizations for marketing and even data science. What do you think is like, what's your take on the next skill that is to be disrupted in this manner? Or, let me put it this way. What is the next skill you'd like to see in the Indian population?
So yeah, I think it's good to see coding as the new math. I think that's how parents are seeing it. If you talk to the parents who spend that money, they're saying that, oh, computer science will help kids in math. Yeah. So I think the next skill we could see is like critical thinking, 21st century skills. What's a new English? Like, or what's a new logic? Like, so I think that's likely to kind of come. And we've started seeing a bunch of startups because what's happening is also that a lot of well-off Indians are looking at sending their kids abroad. And they're beginning to find that if you have to write an essay, you have to write this thing, etc., you need certain kind of training, which IB schools, for example, give. So sort of IB in a box is and sort of like critical things. So I don't have the money to send my kid to an IB school, which costs like 6 to 8 lakhs a year, maybe less, maybe more. But like if I can get a product which is 40,000-50,000 rupees, which is sort of critical thinking, how to write, how to kind of speak, etc. That so sort of like the new English, new critical thinking. Like code is a new math. I would think that could be like yeah. I don't know, but I think it could be.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. Like this is something that we talk about all the time at college, right? Should I take this math class? I think it'll be super helpful in the future. So that was super insightful. I think Anuj will ask the next.
Yeah, so I think somewhere in your presentation you mentioned what I just remember this line. What product exists in a particular market that doesn't exist in this market? Is there an opportunity here? So in terms of that, got me thinking in terms of these westward-looking startups, these strategies that basically take what's happened in more developed markets and try to replicate them in India. So what's your take on westward-looking strategies in startups, and what is there any commonality in where they're missing out in the Indian story and stuff?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think the challenge is market sizing in these, and it's not a bad idea to look at that. China is another thing. A lot of Indians look at China, especially Chinese VCs look at China and say, this happened in China in EdTech and it happened here. You need to kind of structure it for two things. One is, do the same behaviors exist here which drive things? Okay. Two, like it's a market sizing enough. So like raw pressury. Great idea, right? But like beyond like the top 0.1% of India, is there a market? Then you need to be careful. You can use India as a beachhead. So the good way to look at India is at the 51st state of US for consumer tech and B2B software. Like, you know, so like Israel is the 51st state of US for deep tech. So can you innovate here? Can you start here and then go to the US? Or can you go to the Middle East or something? That's also possible. But my fear is with a lot of these derivative, oh, this is happening in the West, like Soylent. Soylent is big in the US. Can you bring it to India? How many people pay for it? I don't know. So fine. I mean, so that is those are the two things. Will the behaviors drive it? Like renting of clothes, like, you know, so we've invested in a cloth rental startup, and I won't say that it's done very badly. I think COVID also impacted it, but it wasn't like setting the world on fire, like, you know. So behaviors matter, market size matter, and that's my only crib with looking at what happened West or what happened in China and seeing this one.
Yeah. So I think just taking off from that question is the whole renting versus ownership and the sharing economy. So it's a two-pronged question. My first question is, how invested is Bloom in companies that focus on this transition from ownership to rentals and the sharing economy? So that's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, how do you think these businesses will pivot in these COVID times where sharing economy is not probably the best thing that people would want to do?
Yeah. So invested in stage 3 and women's and men's, but primarily women's fashion rental business struggled, like, you know, obviously, like, you know, because of COVID and this one. I think strangely, I think sharing is going to come back, but it's going to have powerful interface. Like you go through a dry cleaning system, it gets verified. So what will happen is a stronger trust layer will need to be built on the sharing part. So it'll be like, I'll take from you, or I'll take from Anvita, Divyansh, or whoever, any of you, because you kind of either I know you guys, so it's peer-to-peer sharing, or I know that the software will build in these trust things. This is someone like me. It is dry cleaned. It's coming in the dry clean thing, etc.
Right.
So the problem. So certain areas will become challenging, like mobility. Shared mobility is a challenge because, like, you know, but then you'll build things like 15-minute gaps so it can be cleaned, etc., etc. So I strangely think shared ownership will come back stronger with stronger signals built in. I think this is a great time to launch a perversely great time to launch a shared rental ownership business. Strangely, like because people are also coming to the thing that, boss, I have so many things I've not used. What am I doing? Like I purchased this handbag. I've not taken out my handbag for the last this thing, and I spent 40,000 bucks on it. What am I doing? Like, you know. So a lot of those things are there. But I think on the shared rental thing, COVID is a punctuation. Like, you know, I think it'll come back with stronger trust layers built in.
Okay, fine. Thank you for that.
So the next question, right? This is something that we often talk about. You know, having been to the US and seeing, the rise of, cutting edge technologies, and then coming back to India and seeing that, technology really needs to reach the grassroots. What do you think of cutting edge versus the grassroots? Do you think of these as two separate, distinct strategies, or how do you think companies should approach this particular, dilemma?
It's an interesting question, no doubt. So the problem with venture is deep tech, absolute deep tech, lab type technology, which like Khosla Ventures of the world invest in, like Beyond Meat. Tough in India because it takes a long time to build out in India. So unless it's like a really cutting edge scientist, one of his or her kind sitting in India, it's difficult. So we typically look at things which are closer to commercialization. Grassroots is an interesting one. It fits into this theme of Bharat, like, or India 2 or India 3. Like for example, is there something uniquely ground level which you can do, for example? So I would say that if anything, in the venture world, we would like to look at something grassroots, okay, which is uniquely for India, takes into account the unique Indian social community, societal fabric or the peculiarities, as opposed to something which is so cutting edge that commercialization is still a few years away. So you would actually look at that. What can lead to scale faster? Okay?
Yeah.
So, and I think if you're really cutting edge, this thing in India, I don't think should raise from India. It should go and raise from in the West Valley.
That's super interesting, and that's a great segue into like our next question, which is, most of us have read your framework for Indian consumers, India 1, India 2, India 3. So do you think solving for India 2 and India 3 is going to be the next wave? So we've seen like the rise of agri-tech startups that put farmers on like an actual financial grid, an actual technological grid. Do you think solving for India 1 and India 2 seems to be the next wave? What are your thoughts on this?
And before that, it'd be great if you could explain to our audience what India 1, 2, and 3 is.
Okay, yeah. So let me just try and pull it up. Yeah, just a sec. I'll just share my screen for a few seconds more. Yeah, so I wrote this article in which, yeah. So this is sort of how the India consumer stack, and that's what I call, like, so India 1 is really, I probably ask in India 1A, which is like, so anyone who has like an iPhone, you'll be so shocked how few people in India have an iPhone, or go to Starbucks, etc. But India 1 is typically anyone who works, who's comfortable with English, who works in like earning like 30,000-40,000 rupees and above, who's transacted e-commerce, etc., who's users sharing economy, etc. All of that is India 1, about 110 million of us. So your neighbor is India 1, etc., right? And so sort of see it as what 1 trillion economy, sort of like a Mexico. India 2 is the next people coming about the internet. They're the ones who use Jio, like there's your maybe driver or the office, the staff guy in office who's earning 3,000 to 4,000 rupees a month, along with his wife is earning another, whatever, they're sending their, 3,000 is less. So let's say 20,000-30,000 rupees a month. His wife is earning 8,000-10,000 to 20,000. And between them, they're sending their kid to an English school. And they're like aspiring to move into India 1. That's India 2. Third is India 3, which is really it's like the really poor people, right? They're like not really part of the economy really. All of this, the internet economy. So India 2 is kind of this rush of Jio and all this too. Jio also serves India 3, but India 2 started kind of consuming in a big way. And sort of India 2, it's not necessarily rural. Like for example, in Bombay, you can have India 1, India 2, and India 3, right? So people who live in, for example, Kannamwar Nagar or Dharavi would be India 2. India 3 would be like really poor people in Bombay, like very few, but like who don't have a house also to stay in, etc. So they kind of, this is really the framework. And so the specific question that he asked is, yes, VCs have typically been looking at anyone who's serving this India 1, okay? And like a white hat junior comes there, Cred comes there, but actually they may even come in this India 1A, but India 2 is where there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of investment, etc. So far, it's all been promised. Nothing big has come, but good examples of India 2 success are Meesho. Okay. Some of these have been funding successes like ShareChat, but they're not really business successes. Unacademy, Meesho, these are two good examples of India 2 successes. So Unacademy goes to, so it's very useful for a guy in, say, Satna. It's like a town which doesn't, just has one CCD, so Cafe Coffee Day, right? They don't even have a flyover. That's the kind of this thing. They don't have a bookstore. So a Satna, that person would, to get education, had to go to Bhopal, live in a hostel to prepare for JEE or NEET. Now, Unacademy says you are getting high quality teachers, which you better than Bhopal you would get, like Bombay or Delhi type teachers. Teaching you this high quality. So accessibility, quality, and affordability. All three addressed through the app. So these kind of startups like Meesho, you helps you buy something. You are intimidated to go on to like a Flipkart. It's all in English. You are not comfortable. Whereas there's this Saheli who says, "Hey, देखो मेरा ये आया है, ये खरीदना है क्या?" Like, you know, and WhatsApp के through. So that's what I meant. So both. So to come very quickly, India 1 will always be there, and India 1A itself is becoming a sizable market. So Cred, White Hat Junior are all in that category. India 1 is typically where, like, say, India 2 is with mass. So I would say at Bloom, for example, in EdTech, we look at India 2 specific opportunities. Like Class Plus, for example, was a clear bet on that. We're looking at these kind of spaces. So yeah. So
I think to take this from a more macro perspective is that these are clearly like difficult times in terms of economic health of the country and economic health of the world as a whole. Stock markets may be doing well, but there are some problems that need to be solved by the governments or by the markets itself. So Dara Khosrowshahi, the CEO of Uber, says in difficult times, consolidation makes sense. And we've seen a lot of companies, VC-backed companies, start acquiring in the times of like an incoming recession or where business is not growing rapidly and stuff like that. So what is your take on this strategy in terms of consolidation, in terms of difficult times? And is it applicable to your company?
Yeah, it has happened. A couple of our startups have shut down. We're trying to get one acquired by another. Look, this is life, right? I mean, this is consolidations are where, like, as Buffett famously said, the tide goes out, you know, swimming naked. So it's pretty much that. It's all a hand-to-mouth existence for startups, right? You basically want to get some money, somehow reach Series A funding, and then, you know. So suddenly, when there are shocks to the system, yes, and this is a time when the strong get stronger. Like Unacademy, it's incredible. They just got a $100 million round. Recession hits, so they have huge COVID tailwinds. They have a lot of money in the bank. They've been acquiring, like, you know. So you have situations like this, Flipkart. So this is a great opportunity for dominant, well-funded startups to acquire, and it's never been especially if you have tailwinds. It's never been a better time. This is the reality of the world. It's a brutal world. It'll happen, but people do well. I mean, it's fine. Investors take a haircut, whatever. Founders do well. There's no premium. There's no discount to failing in India. It's fine. You will get funding, etc.
Okay. Yeah. And I think we can open up the question answer session to the audience after this last question. Is what does a normal day in your life look like? What does a venture capitalist do in a day from like probably breakfast onwards?
Yeah. So it's great. So it's now worked harder since joining, and I've compared notes with folks. I think when VCs, it's extremely long hours, primarily because at our stage, we get a lot of inbound pings in. So sort of you can look at your day in terms of pipeline. So you can also do the smart thing by structuring it into like 4-hour slots on 2-3 days of the week where you only deal with that. But otherwise you get a lot of mails pipeline, which is I'm pitching this, etc. There's certain things you have to take, certain things you can push. So answering mails is huge. Second, supporting portfolio founders will have problems like so the thing with startup founders or young startup founders is they're all working late night. So like last night at 12:50, like getting a ping that the CTO is promising to join us is not joining for a company. And it's crazy, right? And then you're trying to say, okay, what can you do? You can't do much, but you say, okay, but it's important to show support. So portfolio takes up a lot of time. Third is stuff like your thesis, a tech thesis, etc., writing content. Some people get away with not doing it. Some people do it. Like for me, I think it's important to build my brand and Bloom's brand, so you do it. Then there's internal work of Bloom, like mentoring someone, for example. Say, like an analyst said that she wants to quit, and so that means hiring. And hiring is something I look after as well. So suddenly, that's coming. So I would say it's kind of divided between these things. So pipeline, okay, is there, and you can spend your entire day doing pipeline, and that's fine. You can do entire day in meetings, and you can. The thing with venture is you can spend 1 minute in deciding something, 30 minutes in deciding something, or 1 day in deciding, and you're not wrong, but you'll end up like, so you got to prioritize. So I typically work, I think 12 hours, 10 to 12 hours minimum. Now, I mean, work is also interesting meetings. So, and there's a wonderful tweet, I think I referenced it in one of my posts about turning 1 year in VC. Every meeting is exciting, but the whole grind is tough. Like, and if you don't enjoy meeting founders, if you don't enjoy this, if you can kind of find joy in like saying no to someone, then I think the VC business, you can suffer burnout. And the other thing is the job doesn't change. 3 years, it's not like like even consulting, but it's not like in industry where you started Johnson & Johnson at a certain level and do something else. There's no difference. Me, 4 years from now, I'll be doing something similar. Maybe one element would have gone up when I'm pitching to LPs. Okay. So, but all of the things will remain the same. So I hope I gave you some sense of it. I can get into. Yeah. So we see famously into productivity tools. We're obsessed with productivity tools. We're trying new things all the time. I tried Superhuman. I don't. Now I'm trying these shortcuts. So I have forgot what Alfred. So I recently downloaded Alfred where you're doing shortcuts. So we're obsessed with getting more out. So I'm happy to double click into things, but yeah.
That was super interesting. I mean, I know we use Notion, Superhuman. I know a lot of people started using Hey, the whole inbox thing. So that's super on Twitter right now. So I think our first audience question is from Manav Khaitan. He's actually an incoming freshman at Berkeley. So I'll just let Manav ask the question.
Hey Manav, hi.
Hi Sujit, I'm Manav.
Yeah.
Firstly, just thank you for doing this session. It's been really interesting, and I was just curious about like what your views are on the relative advantages of equity financing versus debt financing, and even like hybrid models like convertible notes.
Convertible notes are equity, and we use convertible notes at very early stage when you don't want to determine the value. Like I said, like you may say that, hey, I'm happy to give you 300K or 500K, but and there are structures like, so fundamentally you don't want to price it right now. Pricing is that I'll take X% stake, so I'll link it to the next round. So convertible notes are very normal. Bloom doesn't do convertible notes because we as an institutional investor want to price it, but angels do convertible notes a lot. Very early stage, a lot of convertible notes. It's very common. Debt versus equity, we encourage debt in certain situations where it's working capital money. Like for example, suppose I'm investing in a company which is say agri-finance company, okay, or say agri company which sells, for example, bots to farmers instead of tractors. So in that case, I have to give it to a farmer, and I give it to the farmer and say, hey, don't pay me anything right now, just pay me 10,000, the rest I'll manage. So this gap can be covered by debt because theoretically the bots can be seized back. So wherever it's possible that money is not is only so it's working capital. So sorry, how do you say? Okay, money isn't for technical risk or product risk, which is the most important this thing, and which you want to back with capital. It's the highest risk, which is low risk, which is bearing a risk on behalf of another customer. Debt is ideal for that. But VCs don't like debt because debt has seniority over equity and we can't get our money back. So it's sort of a fine line. We encourage it, but if a company is doing badly, we try not to get them to have debt because we can't get our money back. Like prefs are critical.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I think our next question is from, I'm going to say it on behalf of Nishma, who's in our audience. So you mentioned that the startup industry in India is very unfriendly towards women.
I didn't
Does he?
say that. I didn't
No,
say
yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah. But I said, yeah, I get the sense. Yeah, go on, go on.
I think she's referring to the part where you were talking about the background, and usually it's dominated by the engineers and stuff like that. So do you have any special advice for women to succeed in this field? And also, does the Indian startup industry have a lot of students who have studied abroad, or do you believe that they don't have the adequate knowledge of Indian market to succeed over it?
So two good questions. And the first one is everybody wants you to change, Nishma. Like, so all of us wanted to change. We've started getting more cognizant of this. And I think everyone feels that I think it's important to have, like, it's just perspectives, right? It's not just diversity theater. It's genuinely good business practice to have more rounded views. And certainly I think, we're all cognizant of that and trying to kind of expand that. So I would say that the startup industry is one of extreme privilege. Everyone who's here is like extremely privileged, well off, etc. So
Right.
I don't think there's no conscious bias, but there are unconscious biases built in. To an extent, if I recommend people, I'll recommend people I've studied with, or which is if I've gone to an IIT, I'll recommend IIT. Typically, because in India, like most IITs are male, 90% chances will be a male who's recommended. So it sort of feeds through that. So we started taking conscious steps. Certain firms have started taking more conscious steps to solve this problem. But overall, people are very cognizant of the need to build. I would say that this is an English-speaking, privileged world. You are amongst your own, like, and nobody is out there to. But there are like unconscious biases. But people are very open to kind of hearing feedback, and all of the good top companies that you get into, like I mentioned Meesho, for example, to all the unicorns, they are all like any Western firm. Like there's no real difference. Like, they're very progressive. Of course, they'll have one odd case where the manager shouts at you or something like that, and which is like the Indian, but otherwise they're as like any, like in the West. So the second question, yes, there are lots of, beginning to have lots more. It used to be very common early on. So a lot of foreign educated guys, Sanjay Nath and Karthik Reddy are Wharton and Anderson School themselves. So we have an INSEAD, we had a Cambridge Judge, we have these are 4 MBAs. Then we have an undergrad, which is Berkeley. So I would say that there are lots, and I think there's fantastic perspective that they bring. They're very well connected. They do very well also because they have international connections. Because their batchmates do well. So networking is very good. So one good way in which you can do this is to be a bridge between Indus Valley and Silicon Valley. Like, so, and that's, I think Berkeley is particularly blessed. And one of the things I should do is leverage thing. So for example, if you like intern, and this, for example, this is a really interesting character called Anmol Maini, who's actually commenting on India tech based in like wherever the Bay Area. So you can actually theoretically kind of be, for example, if an Indian founder is coming to the Bay Area on Twitter, you'll know, meet them, chat with them, tell them, look, hey, there's someone I know who's interested, send them few leads, okay?
Right.
There's so much you can do, and sort of try and be this bridge between this. Where you typically go wrong are trying to apply blanket principles from the West into India. But I think all of the people I've met, young people I've met, thoroughly understand that India is a very distinct market. I think if you can get in, it's not easy to get in because jobs are few. And hey, networks, etc. But if you can get into a VC firm, you will typically tend to do very well because there's strong work ethics, thing, and yeah. So yeah, I hope I've been able to answer.
Yeah, thank you.
So the next question is from Param Patel. Param, I'm just going to let you ask the question.
Sure. Thank you so much, Divyansh. So firstly, thank you so much for your time. I think just to point out, I've been following you for a while, and your thought leadership with your writing, something that comes in very interesting inputs there. And basing my question on that and the previous discussion that we've had, you've alluded to this India 3 penetration idea again and again. And you've already pointed out offline presence, language translation, UI changes, and these light versions of the apps as solutions. But at the same time, India 1 startups still start growing outwards rather than inwards. I mean, with their first wave of expansion. So my question here is, will students with their foundations built on educational resources from predominantly American VC or entrepreneurship titans be the ones to crack the code. Because, and the reason this is interesting is because even many of the examples that you gave in the discussion actually cited a lot of those resources, and that's what we end up looking at in the first go. So where are these pan-tier entrepreneurs going to be building their foundations from?
Yeah, no, I think, in fact, if anything, the great India 3 startup will be built, I think, by someone outside India, because it will mean kind of, and perhaps, who knows, a Berkeley alumnus could build it. The reason I think is that actually you said it very well, like Misho, etc. I think they're both not necessarily, I think they have American degrees. But I think fundamentally, I think first principle thinking is very vital. It's not necessarily taught in India. It's a skill. And I think you need strong first principle thinking to make these India 3 kind of plays happen. And that is the single biggest reason to look afresh. For example, sometimes you need to look at Africa, sometimes you look at Latin America, sometimes you look at China to really have fresh perspectives. And I think in India, I think Indian entrepreneurs look to the West to a far greater degree. They look abroad. So I think while yes, there will be great Indian entrepreneurs like who come in, but I think India 3 will be cracked, I think, from the outside. Look at it. India's biggest India 3 app is WhatsApp. It was built in the Bay Area, but it was not built for India, but it was built for a problem of the simplest communication protocol. How do you make communication so simple? And they kept the app so simple that for about 50 to 60 million Indian, WhatsApp is the internet. I mean, they don't need to come outside of it. So this is what I feel, that I think India 3 will be more products which are built with simplicity, built like for the widest this thing, and they'll get appeal. They'll find appeal there. Like TikTok is a great example. It's not built in India, but has huge Indian appeal amongst the masses. Like, so, but yeah.
Sure. Maybe just to add to that as a caveat, since you mentioned this growth of tier 3, not tier 3, India 3 startups coming from the outside as well, what do you think is, say, stopping the growth of the Indian startup ecosystem? Like, what's the limiting reagent? Is it talent, consumers, VCs, government, or culture, or all of the above? We usually see many of these factors being discussed by different kinds of VCs. So yeah.
Yeah, I think government has been supportive, but there are some flip-flops like angel tax and all that. But I don't know if that, and there are certain sectors which are heavily regulated, like drones. So the reason we have a massive amount of drones used in weddings is because they can't be used in agriculture. That's the only space you can really monetize. So anyway, now big fat weddings out of the way, when that is gone. So I would say that government is doing and will do more over the next few years. So that's great. I think it's fundamentally down to, I think, talent coming in. There is venture money. I don't think there's any doubt on that. There's venture money. I think it's also the quality of talent, the quality of ideas you're working on. Like I still feel like out of the 3,000 ideas we get, even just 600, 700 are really fundable. Like, the rest I can just dismiss in like 2 minutes, a minute. I may get it wrong, but so I think the quality of talent and the quality is still can evolve. I think that's the limiting factor, I would say. VCs will come. Look, this demand, supply will make itself felt. There's no problem about it. But
Thank you so much.
All right. So we'll try and wind up by 12:30. And so we'll take the last few questions from the audience. Yeah. Arth, do you have a question?
Yeah, hi. I actually had a question about, this was an idea that I'd heard of in a recent talk by a VC from Silicon Valley. And what he mentioned was there's this mindset that a few VC firms have, which is because they're so focused on simply moving a startup from one round of funding to the next. So Series A to B, then B to C, and so on. And that's where they make a lot of their money through fees. What ends up happening is they end up putting a lot of startups through that don't necessarily, like you mentioned, that idea of product market fit, that gets diluted. And again, the incentive to get a good product out, that disappears because, again, they're just raising more rounds and more startups and just continues. So do you have any thoughts on this trend? And at least it was a little disturbing to me, but yeah.
Great question. So this could go on for hours, but very simply, I think the challenge is as follows. The nature of the VC business and dictates that companies grow fast, 7 to 10 years, and they have to go through certain rounds of funding to subsume, to manage, to cover certain kinds of risk. So we cover very early stage customer product risk. Series A covers the growth risk and so on, right? So the challenge is we don't make money when a new round happens, we don't get any fees. Our valuations go up. Like if you hold 10% in a company and that company was valued at 5 million, it's worth 500K. When it goes to the next round, like the 10% may come down to 8%, but it'll be 8% of 5 million. Like, you know, so that's how, like, that's how it works. So there's incentive for us to drive up the valuation, no doubt about it, because we make markup. But the reason we also encourage them to raise funds is validation is critical, right? Because you need money to grow and you need money and it's validated by other person. Also, when founders talk to VCs, you learn a lot. When you go and keep articulating your proposition, like this is what I'm doing, this is when the VC asks questions. So improves. So the founder who has a lot of conversations with VCs, it's like you, if you have to go and present your idea 30 times, you'll actually like learn a lot, because just the way, that's the way of articulating it, etc. You learn a lot. So I think funding is the flip side, other side of the coin. It's heads. If heads is business, tails is funding. It's required. Because if you don't get funding, how will you run experiments? How will you grow? Problem, what you said is actually right is, and I alluded to this, India, you can actually fail in you can get PMF, like for famously called Indiranagar market fit, which is okay. So you can have PMF in one part of India. When you move from India 1A to this, you can lose PMF, like Hinge, a dating app, or Hinge, or whatever Indian equivalent, right? I mean, there is no market outside of folks like you. Like, you know, so what happens? The other market is matrimony. Matrimony is a dating for India too, like, right? So or TikTok is used by dating, for example. So dating is pervasive, but nobody wants to go to a dating app as such. So scale break. This is what I call scale break. As you move from one scale to the other, if your product doesn't fit into the ethos, the cultural, the behavioral need states, there is no market fit. You have to discover product market fit again. And hence, very important for the VCs to look at and say, will this translate to this thing? Which is one of the reasons why White Hat Junior, when it came, I had doubts. Finally, we couldn't invest in it because of many other reasons. But would this play in Meerut? Would this play in Satna? Like, would this play in, like, so we didn't know. And I don't know what the audience breakup there is, how many people from small towns, but this is one issue. And my term for this is called scale break. And India, scale breaks can happen. As you move from one phase to other, scale breaks can happen. Yes. Is this accentuated by what VCs are doing? Kind of. Okay. Because the nature of our business demands that you hyperscale. So for question I would ask is, maybe those startups shouldn't have tried to take VC money in the beginning, but it's sort of this tricky thing. So what you're saying is right. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it's a structural issue. It's not that the VCs are doing it intentionally. Why would we want the startup to flame out? But that's
no, of course.
Yeah.
Just part of the flip side, as you said.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ajit. It was a great session today. I just have one question. I think it's very similar to what Earth asked, but still I think it is differentiated in the sense that, so there is this cycle, right? As a VC achieves certain success stories, it can raise larger rounds from the LPs, and then the cream of the startups will choose to partner with the same larger growing VC, and this cycle keeps growing, So this is detrimental as only certain companies which meet the investment philosophy of that particular VC will receive funding, and hence the overall innovation in the ecosystem will be dampened. So how do you break this cycle of VCs growing larger and dominating the industry?
Okay, I don't know if, Sequoia's getting larger and larger, Lightspeed's got larger, Axel's got larger and larger, but at the same time, there's so many people who have come, so many new VCs who have come, and there are 10 partners from here breaking up to start their own companies, etc. So I think it's a fair fear. I mean, I'm saying it can theoretically happen, yes, but I don't think I don't think it's likely to happen. Just that it's sort of like you'll have these top firms and they'll have their philosophies, etc. But there's so much happening. Who would have expected in the last 4 or 5 years that Bloom would have to vacate its 400 to 500K position and move to 1 million? Because there are so many of these angel lists, Let's Venture, Venture Catalyst, Inflection Point Ventures, Hurdle, you just name it. Like there's so many have come. So the Indian market is fast evolving. What you said, while it's a fair fear, I think there is a long way to go before we reach that. Maybe we'll never reach that. Some questions in the chat. Do you take
Anuj, I
industry?
think you're muted.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
There
think
are
we
some
would like
questions in the chat. Should I just take them? Like this one.
all right, like, yeah, we can take a couple of them from the chat. Yeah.
Do you take industry special with decades of experience? Hey, that's me. So yes, but it's less common because specifically you have to fit into the venture construct, venture mindset, etc. So I think in these cases, typically you will only get in if you're well known to the partners. But yes, like if you're VC and fintech is a big area of interest, it's great to have someone from, for example, who led digital at Yes Bank or So do take, but rare, yeah. Typically, it's more common for startup founders from that industry to come in.
Yeah. Do we want to take one more question from the chat?
Yeah, isn't the 220 structure outdated? I thought it's a good question.
Okay.
Yeah, the 220 structure can change. So Axel and Sequoia and all have 320s. Okay. So but your fair point is, look, it can change. It'll change, and some of these things are like set in saying we're not going to change it, but over time it could well change. And I specifically think we're beginning to see a lot of these startups such as Indie.vc, founders Indie.vc, and were doing revenue-backed financing and stuff like that. So I think some of these new models of venture capital that as they come up, we'll start seeing it changed. So especially if very early stage, you're going to use machine learning to kind of deduce, then you don't need two. You can just do with one. So you may have 1 and 30, So, so stuff like that. Yeah.
I think we'd like to wrap it up now with the last question. We've tried to include as many questions as we could. So the last question is, your job probably, we saw it in the Payne report, your job probably makes you say no much more than yes.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with saying no to people so often?
Yeah, so I try and reply to every mail I get, and I have templates. So I have a standard template, which is for startups which are very good, I try and articulate a reason why. But the simple reason, and the most critical reason, is a great startup can get rejected, even if it's a great team. Actually, I didn't go with that in my deck. So there are 3 reasons, etc. But it's fine. That is not the objective. So if the team, the market opportunity, the product is still great, you can end up rejecting a startup because it conflicts with some of your ones. Also, sometimes because, hey, you're great, but I have something greater still.
Yeah.
So the relative stack rank matters a lot. And I think that turns out to be the hardest to explain. But I've started trying to explain. A lot of VCs don't say no because of this simple reason, that they don't know how to explain it. That there's nothing wrong with you.
Yeah.
It's actually that I have something better. Like people, it's not you, it's me. So yeah. It's not, you're perfect. Find another fund who will love you. It's just that we have something else that's likely bigger. And how do you know? It's just gut. So
okay.
Any time in a point, a VC has 1 to 2 things he or she wants to take to the IC, etc. And hey, we have a lot of FOMO. When a company we have rejected that goes on to raise another funding, it's like a punch to this thing, right? And it can actually create a lot of FOMO, can create a lot of anxiety. Bessemer has this wonderful thing called anti-portfolio, they put it up there. Bessemer Venture Partner, you should read it. It's very humbling. So yeah. I have a couple of companies I've passed on and were doing really well, and I use the learnings from it. So there's a lot of anxiety and FOMO in the VC business too. Like, you don't know, will this become big? But I try and write a well-crafted note. So I've got kind of 2-3 levels of notes. So if it's a great founder, like I try and sign up saying, hey, I give this explanation and say, keep raising money and give me heartburn with every next round. Yeah. So try and do that. Look, it's not antagonistic. Great founders and great VCs are on the same side. They know how tough our business is, the seasoned founders. It's just that there are a lot of founders who think, oh, VCs are their own money. They're like, nothing like that. We are cognizant of the fact that founders are out there to change the world, and we're really supporting them. So, yeah, it's
perfect.
Great. So my email ID is there with, I think, I don't know if it's there in the presentation, but it's...
we will share it, everyone.
Share it? Yeah, I'm just putting it in the chat. It's a short one. Feel free. I'm very good on email, very bad. So if writing to me, don't ask me for a chat. But ask me 1-2 specific questions and I'll do my best, and we could always begin from there. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm not muted. Okay. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Sajid. I'm just going to hand it off to Anvita for a quick vote of thanks, and then we can wrap up.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Speaker Series India at Berkeley, I would really like to thank Mr. Pai for taking out the time to interact with us today. And I'm sure your presentation has enlightened many of us here and motivated us to give back to our society. We hope to stay in touch with you and host you in person at the Berkeley campus in future.
Love that. Yeah.
Thank you so much once
Thank
again.
Thank you. All the best. Feel free to reach out. I'll say goodbye now.
I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us today. And I hope this was an enriching experience for you all, and you'll join us for our future events. Talking about that, we have an amazing lineup of speakers ready, so stay tuned. Please like and share our page on Facebook and Instagram to get all the updates. You can find the link to our Facebook on the chat. And yeah, thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sajid.
We staying on?
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.